Evening, everybody. Everybody happy? Yes? Does everybody speak English? Because otherwise, my Arabic is not up to this. So you've all just seen the film, yes? Anybody here not in here that didn't see the film? No? Okay, all of you. How many voted at 5? The rest of you I'm not talking to for the whole of the rest of the evening. Where were you? What did you see? We have many conversations at the Literature Festival, the Emirates Airlines Festival of Literature, which happens in March, thank you, I'm getting the nod from the artistic director, which are about the genesis of story, what good story is, and of course the fantastic people that run the Literature Festival get great authors who are the generators of fantastic stories from around the world to come and talk about their books. And one of the conversations that I often have, whether I'm sitting on a stage talking to Jeffrey Archer or whoever it may be, is about how many different ways there are to tell the same story. And one of the greatest illustrations of that is when an author's story that's come from their head is adapted through the brain, through the eyes, through the mind, through the heart of a film director to turn their story into the director's version of their story, such as we have just seen. Ian McEwan, who you and I both know, wrote his story called On CHESIL Beach. And for Ian, it was about repressed English, sociological, emotional behavior, the words unspoken, the things unspoken, the hinge points on which lives turn. That's the film we've all just seen, yes? My little short note was sliding doors for people with emotional literacy, I suppose. But what I want to ask you, Dominic, sorry, weird introduction, long introduction, when you first read the book, or the screenplay, because Ian had started a screenplay, what was it in this story that resonated with you that made you see visually the film that you wanted to make? Is that a good starting point?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it's a tricky thing to answer because my decision-making tends to be quite intuitive and really about a feeling about the writing. And actually, the screenplay was very vivid, and there's a really interesting mix, which I think is true of McEwan generally, of a combination of a kind of critique, like an outside view of a situation, and a deep kind of connection, empathy with the people in that situation. And so, I mean, I recognize the social world of it because it's the world of, you know, my parents were married in 1960, my grandparents are the world, you know, I understood that very held in, very avoidant kind of emotional world of the piece, and connected with it immediately. And you know, there's no denying the quality of the writing because Ian had done the adaptation himself. It was, you know, the writing had a kind of three-dimensionality to it that you don't get in a lot of film scripts. So it really stood out.
Let's start with the writing then, actually. Here's a good place to start because famously, you've not only directed an enormous number of plays, you've written a lot of plays. You're a very well-known dramaturg. It's not by accident, and it should say here that you're Dominic Cook, CBE. You've been gonged for your artistic output. When you read the screenplay, so let's get this right. Ian McEwan wrote the book, which is technically a novella, although, of course, the Booker Prize for which it was entered had a problem with it because they thought if it's a novella, we can't give it the Booker Prize, but they wanted it on the shortlist. So you got 40,000 words to play with. He'd then he'd written the first draft of a screenplay or second, third draft?
He'd written a few drafts. I mean, it got very, very close to production with the director you might have heard of called Sam Mendes. And,
really?
What happened was that Sam, I don't think this is any secret, they got very close to production, and then Sam was offered the first of his James Bond movies.
Oh, really? He turned down On CHESIL Beach for James Bond.
Yeah, and obviously he made that choice. And then another director came on board. It was, you know, found a couple of actors, but it never, I don't know what happened, but it didn't quite land. So it had been sitting around for a few years. Ian went on to other things. And the producer, Liz Carlson, who had done exactly the same thing with Carol, which was another script that had been sitting around for quite a long time that no one had made, that had been commissioned for one person and hadn't happened. So she's got a real skill at making these scripts that other people haven't made work.
By Carol who? See?
The Carol is the Patricia Highsmith book, which Kate Blanchett was in, and she eventually made that I think it was released about 2 years ago. So she wanted to do the same thing with this, and she sent it to me, and we'd had conversations about other productions, other shows, other films, and it went from there. And then I met with Ian.
And what did you say? What did he say?
Well, I think it was quite a kind of testy meeting.
Ian's quite difficult. He's very shy. He lives in his head an extraordinary amount. He can appear rude, but he isn't.
Well, I mean, I have to say, we did have the most brilliant collaboration once we got working. But initially, it was quite guarded, I would say.
Okay.
And it was guarded because, in retrospect, I realized, because he was like, oh, here we go, here's another director saying they might do this film, you know? And I think he was a bit, if you commit to doing it, then we'll talk, kind of thing. But at the time, I didn't realize that that's what he was saying. However...
You know, authors don't mind these conversations because it's always the director that pays for lunch.
Right. I don't know who paid for lunch, I can't remember. but I do remember, I mean, in the end, I think we did connect and talk in a fair amount of detail about the piece and what was important. And I asked him, you know, actually I asked him about the process of writing the book, because I'm always trying to get to the core, the center of what something is. And the great thing about working with living writers is that they might be able to tell you, sometimes they don't know, and sometimes what they think it's about is not what it's actually about, but it's a really good place to start. And
how did it go with Ian? Did he know?
I think at that point he'd kind of forgotten.
Okay, that helps.
Well, because he'd moved on. I mean, he certainly knew what was important to him in where it was at that point. And then there was a real change. Once the next stage was getting, I'm just thinking about this, then I met with Saoirse Ronan. I saw Brooklyn, and he really wanted her to do it because she was in Atonement.
Yes.
And they just really got along well. I mean, they're great together, those two. They're hilarious. There's a real chemistry between the two of them.
Right.
And I met with her. I saw Brooklyn. I thought she was outstandingly good. In fact, I loved that movie. I thought that was a brilliant adaptation and a brilliant, I think, realization of a novel in filmic terms. Anyway, I met with her. We got along really well. She was desperate to do it. And she suddenly said, quite unexpectedly, okay, well, these are my dates. We'll do it. And this was over a year before those dates, which is very unusual.
Good Lord.
It's
a gift for you.
Yeah, it was brilliant, but it was kind of odd because suddenly we knew what we were doing and we stuck to those dates. So at that point, I then started working with Ian on developing the script. And then it just took off. Because once he knew that I was on board, this is my reading of it, you'd have to ask him about whether that's the truth, but he absolutely embraced the work we did together. We worked together in a very, quite decisive way, I would say. There were a few things we didn't particularly agree on, but we listened to one another and we really fired off one another. And we developed a real trust quite quickly. I've worked with writers a lot in the theatre. I ran a new writing theatre in London. I trust writers. I mean, my basic position is to trust writers. So
You have to trust, you can trust good ones, but there are plenty of bad ones you can't trust, especially for film.
maybe, yeah, I've been lucky with that. I've only worked with...
Can we talk a little bit about collaboration then, while we're on that? How many actually, audience members, how many of you write? How many of you have written screenplays? How many have written novels or short stories or poetry? How many of you just write? Okay, how many of you have got screenplays had to look at by producers or directors or... No? Okay. So if we talk about collaboration, is that interesting? Yeah. Let's talk about collaboration. The art of writing a novel tends to be individual, in your head, on your own, in a room, often for months, if not years. A bit similar with theatre, with plays, is it?
I think I would guess, I don't know that many novelists. I would guess that theatre writers tend to have a slightly more extrovert side to them, or a side that really naturally enjoys the collaboration. I don't think that's necessary to be a good novelist. But actually, Ian has written a lot of scripts, so he is an unusual writer because he started writing scripts. I think he wrote scripts before he wrote novels, and he certainly has written original scripts, he's written other adaptations of other people's prose. He'd never written an adaptation of one of his own novels until this point.
So for him, it's easier for you because he knows how it works. He's not being brought out of the authorial box, the author's box, and put into the screenplay writer's box, and it's bright lines and miles, and he's having to talk about stuff. That's fine. But for you, you have the difficult thing of talking to the novelist
that's
who's
complicated.
adapted his own novel into a screenplay. Where are the eggshells that you have to avoid treading on in that as the director?
I think you have to get all of that anxiety out of the way and focus on what is the best way of making this story land for the largest number of people. And I suppose, one of the things I noticed was that, Ian is a rarefied and highly intelligent man, and the writing had a slightly, especially at the end of the novel, it had an ambiguity and a kind of esoteric edge to it. And I just thought the audience needed catharsis in purely crude terms. That in a novel you don't necessarily need that catharsis, but the audience, they didn't need a happy ending, they didn't need a resolution, but they needed to feel that some kind of change had happened.
Sort of tying up in a bow.
Well, they just needed to see. I mean, in the end, what we came to, but it was a discussion, was that the feeling he had this scene in Wigmore Hall, but he wasn't there, and I suggested that he went to Wigmore Hall.
He sits in 9C.
And I was a bit nervous about it because I thought, oh, this is a bit crass in Hollywood, I mean, you've got this great novelist, he's incredibly sophisticated, isn't he just going to say, oh, you're so corny? But actually, I think he understood what I was trying to do, which was allow the audience to see the effect on the characters of the decision that had been made. That was the thing. This was never going to be a story that had a happy ending.
Quite.
And there's a page at the end of the novel which kind of sketches what happened to me. And we kind of extrapolated the information from there and then expanded it out. And that was what we did.
Was that a long conversation with Ian, though? Did you have to really set your stall out and sell it to him?
No, it wasn't. It was surprisingly quick. And I tell you, the other thing was that what was interesting was that I would have a conversation with him. Sometimes he'd be a little bit, push it away a bit, and then he'd come round or not. But I realized that was about testing out the idea. He was really receptive and interested. He was very interested in what was coming his way.
Okay.
I mean, almost as a kind of intellectual exercise, and then once a bit after that, we then get into how does that work. And I trusted his taste. I mean, sometimes I suggested things and that just wouldn't go in. I don't think a writer can write something unless it really lands inside them. I think you've got, if you're working with a writer, you've got to respect that. I think if you're trying to get the writer to write something that they don't feel is a too general a word, but have some kind of connection with, then it won't really resonate for the audience. So,
Use the word trust.
yeah.
You have to trust the writer.
Yeah.
But of course, that's a two-way relationship. So when do you judge the moment when you've won the writer's trust
Well,
and you
that's
can
really
start to take them on the
difficult,
journey you need to take them on?
I think you just got to proceed until you encounter resistance. Lead by example. I mean, you've got to just keep going. I mean, that's true of any working relationship in any area, and I think it's especially true of the creative world where we're using bits of ourselves. I think you just have to have faith that will land. The fact is, he backed me to direct the film.
Exactly,
He hadn't seen any of my work. I tell you, there was a great moment where the only other thing I'd done on screen was these Shakespeare adaptations, and he called me up like as soon as it was finished, the broadcast, and said that was amazing.
Oh, really?
And I thought, oh, that's good.
That helps. That helps.
You
exactly.
wouldn't do that if you were indifferent or if you wanted to be polite. You'd wait for a few days, and so I thought that was it. But in the end, you just got to keep going and hope that what you're saying and the work will prevail.
In most, I've told you this story before, so forgive me for boring you, but there's a film director called Terry Gilliam who I'm friends with, and many years ago, he and I were trying to figure out whether there's an algorithm, whether there's a formula for good adaptation. I was talking from I've written books, we were talking about how films will normally get it wrong, and he was saying, yeah, but when films get adaptation right from a novel, they really get it right. And he was citing things like Peter Benchley's book Jaws, which is an appallingly bad book. Even Peter Benchley says so, as I'm allowed to say it. But a brilliant film. Spielberg made a brilliant film for a really bad book. One of the arguments is, in fact, we came up with this formula, which is, do you mind if I do it?
No, please.
The average 120,000 word novel has between 600 and 700 events in it. We call them paragraphs. The average 120-minute film has between 60 to 70 events. We call them scenes. And compressing that into that is normally what the lot gets lost in translation. But of course, the joy of this adaptation is it's a novella. There aren't multiple story strands going on that you as the director have to take executive decisions about. We don't need that, we don't need this, we don't need that. So I'm assuming that actually in terms of adaptation, not only is it the fact that McEwan's written his own screenplay, that helps, but also it's quite a nice linear story. One central storyline, two main protagonists that you can tell. You could tell in a straightforward linear fashion. Obviously, you've done beautiful pacing with this film, I have to say. But do you think that made it easier, or did that come with its own complications, that there aren't quite enough colours in the box to paint the whole picture?
No, I think it was really useful that it's a novella. I mean, it's hugely useful. I think your responsibility, if you do take a large, proper, full-length novel, and one of the reasons why these things tend to work better as TV series than films is exactly for the reason that you've described, because there's just a volume of material that you have to put on screen, is when the director makes a bold, interpretive decision about what this piece is about.
Yeah.
And I think I always think that directing is a mix of incredible arrogance and humility. And I think, you need, if you're working on something that pre-exists you have to kind of lean into it and work out what the spark was, what the dynamic at the center was for you, and translate that into another form. And I really think that if you try and just fillet it, just like take all the bits out and just make it a little bit shorter, it won't have a dynamic, it won't have a life. You've got to reinterpret the core dynamic and then find a filmic way of doing it. And I've done this in theatre, it's a similar exercise. Of course, the results are very different, but you're still trying to do the same thing, which is to try and get to the core and the center of it. So that, but of course we didn't have to do that, because we've done pretty much everything that was written in the book, plus more, because it's such a short book.
What you have just said is almost exactly what Wes Anderson said when he was promoting Grand Budapest Hotel, based on, in fact, a number of Stefan Zweig's short stories that he conflated together, because he knew exactly what Stefan Zweig was writing, and he said, this is what it's about. It's extraordinary when that works.
I think you can, it is a hugely creative process, but it's a wonderful thing when you can get to something in someone else's work that goes, okay, within you, that sparks something, and no, it's thrilling that. But I feel I kind of got it. I think maybe that was in the end where the connection was between us, and that's why we were able to work together.
Can we talk a bit about sort of film industry nuts and bolts with it? So funding, it's BBC and...
It's BBC and Lionsgate with the distributors, but they put quite a bit of money up front, so they pay for it, and then the lead producer was Liz Carlson and her business partner, Steve Woolley. They run a company called Number 9. They've done a lot of stuff.
Sure. So budgets
were
acceptable. You weren't constantly bashing your head against a brick wall.
I'd never made a film before.
Sure.
So I didn't really know, to be honest. I mean, I found the lack of time frustrating, and if I ever did it again, which I hope I will, for me, time is the thing that is most precious, the thing that I would fight for more than anything. Because for me, you have to have a little bit of kind of air in the system so that you can correct yourself, try things out. Even when you're incredibly well prepared, there's always an element that you discover on the day. And I thrive in those conditions. I don't thrive in the breaking it all down and going, okay, so I'm going to shoot this here, and shoot this here. I just don't think, for me, I can work like that. So, and I've been very spoiled in the theatre because I have, it's much easier.
You have a space, you have your players.
The conditions.
Did you rehearse? How much time rehearsing?
We had very little time because so what happened was that Saoirse was doing Lady Bird, and those dates were fixed. So we were running out of summer. We started shooting
We're given so many outdoor
on the
sets.
22nd of October, and every morning I would look up and I'd look at the trees outside my house. They go, oh, the leaves look like they might fall. They look like they're going to fall. So we did all of the stuff in the Chilterns, which is the area around Edward's house, which is actually where Ian lived. So he knew that area very well. It was very much in his mind, that landscape. And we shot that in the first week. And that meant we didn't have much time to rehearse. No, we had 3 days. And then I grabbed people, but you can do a lot. So Emily Watson, I sat down, we chatted for 3 hours. She wasn't able to come to rehearsal because she was doing another film, and you just grab the time you can. But again, next time, if I can, proper rehearsal. Because when you turn up on set and you've really rehearsed, you just go, and it's a very different kind of experience.
Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I
just
loved
saying,
it.
is it? It's such a different
loved
dynamic
it.
for you. Would
I
you want
loved
to do it again?
Oh, God, yeah, I absolutely loved it.
What's so good about it? What makes it different, better than
I don't know what
theatre?
it was. I think probably for me, there's an awful lot of stuff that was very familiar to me because I know I've worked with actors a lot and I've done a lot of dramatic storytelling, but I absolutely love film sets. I love the mix of planning and anarchy and the spirit of all these people pulling together to make something happen. I really thrived in those conditions, and I would gladly do it again. What I had to learn about was the politics and the business and the money side of it, which is a much, much more important component than in the theatre.
Well, there's another dynamic that strikes me, which has just come to me. Of course, you are at heart a creative. You're a writer. You have that creative spark, and you've exercised that largely in theatre. Does not the logistics of film, do you not find that utterly depressing and repressing and constricting?
No, I love it. It's all creative. It's all creative because it's all about, logistics about how much time you have, where you're going to shoot the film, all those things. They're really, you're making the film while you're doing that. You're making the film before, when you first go on your recce's to locations and who you're choosing to work with and the discussions that you have with your designers and all of, No, I love all of that. I had to learn a lot, don't get me wrong. There was a steep learning curve, but...
Well, can you just explain briefly? I don't want to embarrass you or anything, because you've made a brilliant work of art. But how did you start to learn about lenses, about POVs, about cameras?
I don't really know about lenses, to be honest. I had a brilliant... I did these 3 Shakespeare films, as I said, which were like an amazing training ground for me. I did 6 hours of television, some of the hardest Shakespeare plays, some of the hardest plays he ever wrote.
Yeah.
6 battles, 4 coronations, 50 people on either side of a battle that actually had 20,000. It was like a real test, but I learned a lot. And in both instances, on that one and on this one, I had brilliant DOPs.
Right.
I had Sean Bobbitt on this, who is one of the greatest. Mm-hmm. And he's a true artist, and he's very collaborative. He also knows his own mind. And we worked beforehand very, very closely on the language that we wanted to use. And we very intentionally decided, we looked at a lot of period movies from the early 60s. And we decided to go completely against the way that films are shot and made now. We shot on film, for example, which I know a lot of people do now, again, which is good. But we decided to do every scene in a minimum number of setups. So a lot of scenes are one setup. Right. And that's because that's how they did it in '62, and I wanted to get a feeling of that period in the way that we made the film, and also for a creative exercise for me, because the Shakespeares were done with 2 cameras all the time, and chop, 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 lots of cutting. And I really wanted to do something where it was being made in the camera. So, once we got into that, we then these questions, the technical questions, kind of start answering themselves. And he's a genius when it comes to lenses. Obviously, he showed me the shot he had in mind each time, and sometimes it was right, sometimes it wasn't. So, if you get the right person, the right support, then actually the technical knowledge is something one can learn on the job.
And actually, I'm pleased to hear you say that, because I hadn't really figured that when I was watching the film. But of course, there are quite a lot of long shots in it, which also gives the actors, the performers, an enormous amount of room to breathe. And of course, actors, and you know how to get a good performance out of actors.
I I loved this book. Someone who, I remember, actually, funnily enough, it was one of the guys from Lionsgate, who I knew a few years before, gave me this book quite a while ago, which is the Truffaut-Hitchcock Conversation book, which is, I think, the most amazing book about storytelling. I mean, it's not just about film, although it is very much about film. It's just a brilliant book that everyone should read. I mean, you know, the passion, the detail, it's just phenomenal. And, you know, Hitchcock was legendarily enigmatic, but Truffaut understood every frame of every film and knew them, and that unlocked him. So he talked very openly about it. And he said that the worst thing that ever happened to film was the invention of sound. Because once sound came in, rather than telling the story through the camera, all that happens is we get talking heads, which is TV, which is a lot of TV directing. It's just get close up all the time. And I always had that in mind. I mean, I still feel like I've got a lot to learn in that area, but, you know, how are you framing the shot? How are you trying to distill the story within the shot? Yeah. And actually, again, Ian really understands film. He talks in visual metaphor.
He writes in visual metaphor.
Yeah, he does. And he has a very strong sense, for example, of place in all his books. So settings and all of that detail are very much inside him. So I had that material, I had that kind of launch pad there in the script.
Despite what you've just said, sound plays an important role in this. There is a lot of music in it, apart from anything else. You had a good sound guy.
Yeah, brilliant. We had a brilliant sound recordist because we were working in insane conditions like that beach, that strip of beach.
Yeah.
So it's 19 miles long, and the only way we could get to the bit we wanted to be in was to cross the lagoon, which is what in UK is called a site of special scientific interest, which means that you can't breathe or you'll disturb something. So it's a nesting ground, and the water's that deep, so you can't use a motor on your boat to get across. So we had someone rowing, or actually pulling us across, like in small boats. So the whole crew, spending 3 hours, all of that, and then the wind and everything. The sound guy, Ian, was amazing. And then I actually didn't want to use much score. Again, I feel in contemporary films, people are so lazy with score.
Right.
If they can't solve the scene and they don't know how to get the performances out of the actors or whatever, they just put tons of music on top. So we tried, there's a brilliant composer called Dan Jones who did it, but the amount of score it's not very much.
It's subtle.
We used what Ian had put into the script and then found other source music where we could. Yeah.
Just in terms of shooting, I've walked CHESIL Beach I read geology as my degree. That shingle is appalling to walk on.
Really difficult. It's like a workout.
Every time you made Saoirse walk down, I was thinking, you poor girl.
Yeah, no, you use like something like 3 or 4 times the amount of energy to get from A to B. So yeah, no, it's a very particular place.
One other question from me, and then we'll open it to the floor. There's a scene that features a sparrowhawk on CHESIL Beach. I'm sure we all noticed. I didn't notice a sparrowhawk wrangler in the credits.
Very well observed. Well, we were going to use a real sparrowhawk, but I think it was something like 2 days before we were going to shoot the sparrowhawk unfortunately died.
Ah.
And there were only, I think, 2 trained sparrowhawks in the United Kingdom. The other one was otherwise engaged. So
Taking a prior booking.
So we resorted to CGI.
Is that the only CGI in it?
Sorry?
Was there much other CGI?
More than I'd like.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't really like it that much. I mean, I on the plane on the way over here, I was watching Dunkirk, and they didn't use any CGI in it. It really shows.
And it shows.
Oh, it's so beautiful to see. I mean, it's horrible, but beautiful to see, 1,000 real people standing on a beach, and you can tell the difference.
Yes.
We're not yet, unless you have unlimited, but huge budget. There's a slight feeling of artificiality. Our team were great; they did a brilliant job, but it is a very hard thing. So there are a few bits. With period movies, you have to cheat a bit. You have to paint things out. And, for example, actually on CHESIL Beach itself, there are a very militant group of fishermen who would not be moved. I mean, we tried bribing them, we tried everything we could to get them to move, and also to move their bright orange tents that they planted very close to the water's edge, and in the end we had to paint them out. So there's stuff like that has to happen. I kind of quite like those old-fashioned methods, which are much more organic and much more you know, real and three-dimensional, because I kind of think that on the whole, they resonate for an audience. You do subliminally notice,
Yeah.
you know? It's much more expensive to do things that way, but I do think, for example, shooting on film, it gives you a texture that you don't have with digital, and audiences, regular audiences, might not be able to pick that up, but it affects them. Yeah.
I'm delighted you had militant CHESIL Beach people. It
Yeah,
follows on from
I do respect it.
It follows on from the Ian McEwan story that some of you may not know, I'll tell you. He once wrote that while he was writing on CHESIL Beach, he'd walked along it, and he took up 2 stones to have on his writing desk so that he could handle them while he was writing a novel. And he'd done some interview or something, said, I've these 2 pieces of the shingle from CHESIL Beach. And CHESIL Beach wrote back to him saying, it's a site of special scientific interest, we want our rocks back. And they got very feisty. He got into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, there were legal threats.
Yeah, exactly. Your turn for questions. You are very keen. If you hang on for a second, I'll have a microphone in front of you in less than a minute coming to this side. Thank you very much.
Hello, I like your film. Thank you so much for your work. I think this might not be directed to you as a director, but more to the storyline. As a woman, something I don't really get is maybe it's written in the novel, or maybe it's not so much. It's why she was always so tense. There was a few moments when I thought she was sexually harassed by her father or something. Maybe there were some hints, but I don't know. But I think as a woman, I would appreciate it if there are more details, like you could kind of talk about why she is the way she is. Because for me, she's really frigid, and she's so tense, and she feels so. And the end of the film, I feel like so the guy, he kind of feels sorry because he kind of lost on his chance to have a successful life. He sort of regretted it, but the other thing is, how did she overcome her problem? Apparently, her problem got fixed. She has children and stuff. I mean, we will want to know how it happened. So I think it's more to the storytelling that for as audience, we would like to know, the other side of the logic.
Question, half the audience are nodding at you,
Yeah,
so
no, I mean,
over to you,
look,
Dominic.
okay, so in the book, this is an interesting question in relation to the relationship between novel and screen. In the book, there is the inference that she was abused by her father. And I thought in the book it landed really well because it wasn't the only reason why there are problems in that bedroom. It was the source, in a way, of her terrible fear, but it was not the only reason. I mean, there are people who suffer sexual abuse who live, who overcome that. There are other people who have quite minor sexual abuse whose lives are totally ruined, and every other variety, because it's not just about the event itself, it's about the person and how that is interpreted and how that is experienced. So I kind of wanted to purposefully create something that was a bit ambiguous, that there was the sense that this had happened. And Ian's version actually was that it only happened once. Now, if I went into really explaining that, that's a whole section of the film. And the problem with it is that it makes, I mean, your question is exactly, in a way, right. In a way, what I mean is that your ambiguity, your sense of ambiguity is kind of what we wanted to achieve, which is something happened. It's not a concrete thing that she even remembers that well. It happened once. But it has created within her a fear of sex. But that fear is compounded by the time she's living in, by her background, by the repressive nature of her family situation, where the parents are at war, no one talks about sex or romance or intimacy. She gets a little book put on her bed just before she's about to get married. All of those things matter as much as that event itself. So we were, and in every different version of the post-production, it was either more explicit or less explicit. I didn't want to take it out, because then I thought she really is just, in inverted commas, frigid, or she's got a real problem. Because there are many women from that generation who came from oppressed backgrounds who were perfectly comfortable with their sexuality. Equally, I didn't want to make it absolutely what the film was about, because then the film's not about anything to do with the social period, with the gender politics of the time, with the general feeling of immense emotional repression which existed in Britain at that time. And I'm still on the tail end of that, in that I mean, in my family, no one ever talked about anything. So that ambiguity is kind of purposeful, but annoying to some people. And actually, quite a few people have really expressed consternation at it. Yeah.
But it's nicely counterpointed against the fact that it is set at the beginning of the swinging 60s, when everything is just about to change forever.
Yeah. But people forget, I think, that the 60s didn't really kick in Britain till about 68. And then even then, you know, we were still...
What was the famous quote? Sex wasn't invented in Britain until 1963.
Right, yeah. You know, I mean, it was still even... For me, I was born in 66, growing up in the 70s. We were still in a world of, you know, almost like children should be seen and not heard. We don't... And even the most... I've been thinking a lot about this in relation to fathers, because I think the relationship of fathers has changed so much in recent times in a very positive way, I have to say, and I don't think it's just a middle class thing. I think it's happened a lot across the world in different backgrounds and so on, is that fathers tend to be much more aware of their children, more involved than they ever were. And even in my generation, even the kind of most benign and friendly and lovely fathers were like uncles.
Yes,
they were distant in Britain, certainly.
Exactly.
They were distant. They didn't know anything about their kids. They didn't know what their kids' lives were like. And that evolution that has happened, I think, is positive. It is. They are as much. So I haven't answered the rest of your question. I kind of think that the tragedy of the film is that if they'd have just been able to not react to what happened that evening, to talk and to sit with it and to work it out, they would have got somewhere. Because they really should have been together.
They were in love.
He had a huge amount of pressure on him as well to be a man in a particular way. They were in love, and although they were different, they shared a lot. So I think what happened was that someone who was more patient with her and was able to work through that. Sorry, I think that's the rest of your question.
But of course, he's fighting his own demons because she's a higher social class. She has more social standing, so he's
carrying as much of the society at the time, the trauma of his childhood and his mother's accident, and what's that? Because his family, I think, are naturally more expressive, and then this terrible thing happens, and everything is in crisis. So you know, they're carrying the kind of not the sins of the father, but they're carrying what's happened to them in the past. They're holding that, and it comes together at that moment in the bedroom. And I always think if only he hadn't even gone down the beach, they might have worked it out. If they'd have had just a few hours.
If only he'd accepted her apology and not turned his back on her.
Right. There are so many points at which they might have been able to come through it. And I think that was the idea of the fact that she does marry someone probably quite soon after, a few years after.
My first thought was, if only somebody would make a film about Ted Hughes, because he'd make a fantastic Ted Hughes.
Yeah,
He's got exactly that right face.
Yeah.
Looks very much like a young Ted Hughes. Another question. Please, sir. And then we'll come over here.
Hi, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your style as a director, and specifically those scenes, you know, where it was awkward for them in bed and trying to get to that point, because it was weird for the audience because we were kind of laughing because it was awkward for us, and it was very convincing. So I'm wondering how you guided the actors through that scene.
You know, one of the things was that we scheduled it right at the end. We really shot that stuff. We shot, it was 33 days, I think we had altogether, and we shot that in the last 7 or 8 days, all that stuff. And that, of course, I know it sounds banal, but that really helped. I think it's all about the casting. You know, we started with Saoirse, who I think is one of our greats, and she's already great, but I just think she's going to be Meryl Streep. She's going to be one of those people who has a career that just goes on and on. She can do anything. So she is, you know, gold. And then we searched high and low to find him, and it was very, very hard because of this thing about masculinity and the period we live in. You know, in the West, young men have a very different sense of what it means to be male than men in 1962 did. They have such a different idea, and notions, for example, of sensitivity, of denying things that were traditionally masculine within their temperament in order to be more acceptable socially. It's become a norm, right? And for men of that age, you know, at that time, it was totally different, especially if they came from a more working class background, and finding someone who could give you that kind of slight formality, that sense of masculine energy with a deep sensitivity was unbelievably hard. I mean, it really was. We saw brilliant actors. I mean, really fantastic people. And then when Billy came in, and then we put him together with Saoirse, it was just... And of course, because there was a connection between them, they worked really well together. It meant that when you do those very intimate scenes, which, by the way, is never that easy. I've done it before, and it's always awkward. You know, you are in a really good place because you know it's about the work. I've done kind of sex or love scenes on stage, and I did one in my Shakespeare films. And actually, a few actors have said to me that the problem that they have when they're doing them is that the directors are often frightened of discussing what happens. So there's too much weight to put on them to just improvise, which of course is actually incredibly exposing because that's them, it's not the character.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the first one I did, I storyboarded everything. I sent the storyboard to the actors. I discussed everything with them. On this one, the script was very clear, and I talked to them about it, and we talked about the mechanics of it. And then what happened was on the day when we started shooting it, I spent, I think, the whole morning without the cameras, just plotting it all through with them. And we just did it almost like a fight. You do a fight. A to B to C to D, to just really be clear about what we're trying to do.
We're talking about like a dance.
We are talking choreography because he's really specific in the script, and everything means something. So I think because we're all, I mean, this is part of what the film's about, even in our age now where, you know, things are so open and in certain areas, and, you know, we're still very hung up about sex. It's still difficult to talk about. It's still difficult to engage with. And therefore, if you're making a film that has that element within it, you've really got to be courageous and try not to skirt around it. And we're all adults, you know, we're trying to tell the truth. So it's so bizarre to me that we can do that about violence, we can do that about all sorts of things, but yet the thing that draws us together on the most primal level, we've got a long way to go on that as animals, as in our evolution, in terms of being able to just accept these forces within us and this incredibly important part of our lives, you know.
You captured it so well. The note I wrote about those when they're holding hands and walking towards the bed, they're walking to the bed like they're walking to a scaffold.
Right, yeah.
It's so heavy with the potential for disaster.
I did have a brilliant shot planned, but we ran out of time. I couldn't do it.
What was the shot?
I thought it was great. It was probably 2 on the nose anyway. So we had the set, as you know, like those 2 rooms, and that was a set. A lot of it was done on location. That was all done in Pinewood Studios. It was a set. And I had arranged the walls on camera side, because most of the time we kept the camera on one side of the room, of both sides could come out.
Right.
So if you think about the walls that the people come into the room, that side, come out. And I was going to do a tracking shot really low, along with them, going kind of with them through the wall into the room.
Oh, really?
So as well as the one we've got, I was going to cut to that.
Didn't
it
need
took about 3 hours to take the wall out, so that was that. We ran out of time. But there's so much in terms of accident that you can take advantage of. And in the end, you know, maybe I was being too showy-offy, you know, with that.
It worked as it did. Gentleman here had a question, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, my question was kind of similar to his. How did you direct your actors to obtain the specific emotions, more like the heavy scenes, kind of like towards the end?
Yeah. Well, look, we did do some rehearsal. So I think out of those 3 days, I think I had Saoirse, not for the whole time, but maybe it was 2 days, which was me, Saoirse, Ian McEwan, Billy Howell, and our brilliant dialect coach, a woman called Penny Dyer. She's amazing. And the dialect in this is very important because the way we speak now is so different to how people spoke in 1962. And within that is it's not, you can think of it as a superficial thing, it's not. So for example, she said, you must complete all your words. So if you think about what I'm doing now with my particular slight class, I mean, it's middle class, but slightly declassed. Because now, certainly in the West, what people try and do is they make themselves lower class than they actually are. They make themselves sound more democratic, right? In those days, you didn't do that. You always tried to sound, if you're aware of that, it's not always, if you were aware of it, you try and sound You try and move up the social hierarchy. So she was very good on things like complete the ends of your words properly. Don't, you know, so it would be, whereas I say don't, she say don't, you know, absolutely be confident, drive through to the end of the thought, complete, and actually you wouldn't believe the difference that made to the scenes. Something as simple as that, because it gives you a world. And that also keeps a lid on all of the emotion. You know, really,
Exactly.
within that way of speaking, that's how the British ran an empire, is to keep all the feelings like this, and we are in charge. There is no, you know, the face doesn't show anything. We know what we're doing, we give our instructions, and we move on. And that is embedded in every Brit, and certainly at that time, because that was the archetype everyone was looking to. Still like Queen Victoria, really.
It also explains why Prince Charles sounds the way he does. It's the stiff upper lip that really prevents any vowel sounds from getting out clearly.
So that helped. And you know, I just pushed, you know, you get the chance to do different takes. So if I thought something was not going deep enough, I just would push. More often than not, I was saying, pull it back, show less.
Oh, really?
They wouldn't want to show that much, even if they felt it.
Yeah.
This is my criticism of a lot of period drama now, is that I think people are too emotive, because actors naturally want to do that. They want to show feeling. But if you look at the way, especially in repressive cultures, people are much, much more on the surface like this, very smooth. I was often saying, it's fine to feel it, but don't show any of it. Don't show it.
Interesting.
Oh.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. Thank you.
Quickly, I'm very curious about, you said the book spoke to you personally. How does your ideology, how did that translate with working with the scriptwriter into the final film, and what you want people to walk away with, maybe that's different from the book?
I think that's a really good and difficult question to answer. I think who you are and your ideology are inseparable. I kind of think you've got to bring your whole self to what you're doing, and a mix of your own experience and your emotional life and your understanding of the world intellectually and your political views. They're all they're all the same thing. So I suppose I felt that, my life has been shaped a lot when I look back by that generation and the generation before, of how little they communicated, and how in my culture it was all about denial of feeling, and that really did matter to me. And I also feel that we're whilst there are many things in the world now that I'm despairing about, believe me, you only need to look at the news today and think, oh, what is going on? But I do also believe that we are evolving as well in positive ways. And I think that whilst the kind of culture of expressing feeling can be excessive, I kind of think it's better. It's better that people can, you know, talk about how they've been shaped, experience feeling, express difficulty, not know the answers to things. Because the generations that preceded, especially in Britain, partly because of the experiences that they had, for good reasons at the time, I'm not judging them, there were very good reasons for this, couldn't do that and were conditioned not to do it. And they survived through 2 appalling wars through doing that. But for where we got to after that, it was no longer necessary to be that way. And there were lots of costs to that, lots of costs. So, and I experienced that. So I suppose that was really in me, and I do remember my grandparents' world. And, you know, I mean, lots of things that happened to me where nothing was talked about, and I was expected to work out what was going on. And that, I don't think that was a unique experience. It was an experience for a lot of people at that time, and probably still now.
And not just in Britain or Western Europe.
No. These
It's
things
also
they play out in
universal.
different ways across the world. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And just come back on one thing you said. You gave a hint earlier on that Ian was there on set and was part with it. Was he there throughout
No,
production?
not very much.
Okay.
Bizarrely, he had another film shooting at exactly the same time.
Right. So did he give you notes at all? Did he?
Yes, he got rushes every day.
Right.
So he had, but he was fantastically supportive. I've got to say, he did have some pointers, but the vast majority of it was, oh, this is great, and you know. And I always kind of interpret silence as a positive.
So
I think otherwise you get paranoid and then you start falling apart. So it's.
I mean, it is his book, It is very much your film. Did you see when you saw the first thing, Final Cut, was he there?
He was involved in all that process and incredibly helpful.
What I want to know is,
Yeah.
what were his first words to you when he saw Final
God, I
Cut?
can't remember.
Oh,
But
right,
the thing is, I can't remember because I showed him my cut,
Right.
my first cut, and then he gave me notes. I have to say, most of them were absolutely brilliant notes.
Really?
Yeah, brilliant notes. And I took on board the ones that that resonated with me, which was most of them. And then we did have a period where we did some reshoots.
Right.
And in fact, just anecdotally, there's a scene in the cinema.
Yes.
Well, that wasn't in the original script or in the original cut. I thought it was really important to have a scene where you saw Edward trying
Yes.
and not
Before the bed
achieving,
scene.
before the bed scene
Yeah, yeah.
chronologically,
Quite.
but also that the culture, it wasn't just about the culture, because young people found a way of getting together, like they do in every culture, one way or another. And they in that period, at that place in time, they used to go to the cinema. And that was in the book.
Yes.
So there was just a one-sentence reference in the book that they'd gone to see A Taste of Honey, which was weirdly one of the films that we watched quite closely in preparation for the film. And so he wrote a scene and he did it like that. I said, oh, how about doing that? 2 hours later, I get the scene. And we shot that scene. So it was a collaborative process all the way through. So I can't really remember. Remember his
That makes sense.
response. Yeah.
One final question from me. If you could change one thing now, looking back, because it's some months, I imagine, since you finished the edit.
I would reshoot and redo a lot of those scenes around the table at the beginning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because what we did, again, there was pragmatism. We ran out of time. We were against it, and I strung the scenes together and shot them in quite a simple way. And I think there was a more interesting way to shoot some of that stuff. Because you go from, there's a lot of flashbacks, you go back and forwards, and actually we should have done something much more emotionally illustrative with those relationships. So I'd definitely do that again.
And I lied about saying final question. Final question. You said this is your debut. It's a cracking debut, Don. It really is. Well done, apart from anything else. What would you like to shoot next? If you could have free range, not just an adaptation of a novel, but...
Every day, it's something different. There
Really?
are so many stories that we need to tell.
Oh, yes.
And I feel, one thing to feel optimistic about, because I'm always looking for those things in the world we live in, is that I think artists do have, there's a real need within society to see the world reflected back in an honest way. And I think the appalling dishonesty of so many political leaders and the world of advertising and false values that we're exposed to constantly, there's a really important place for storytelling. And so I feel excited about doing work that tries to engage with that.
You sound like John...
I don't really know yet, but I want to do things that, whether directly or... I thought the film last night was really exciting because there was...
Hostiles.
Yeah, I thought it was really exciting because I thought the film that uses a genre, looks back at the past, but is absolutely talking about Trump's America right now. That
Right
final
up.
scene was Donald Trump versus, the rest of America. And for me, that spoke to me. But I like to do work that's somehow either directly or indirectly speaking to us and trying to help us work our way through this mess that we've got ourselves in.
You sound like Jon Snow in the recent season of Game of Thrones, where if enough people start to tell too many lies, where does the truth reside and how will we ever recognize it?
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen this evening the birth of a new film director, and I think his work is marvelous and a brilliant adaptation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Cook. If you didn't have time to finish off questions, and what a chance, come and have a chat.
Thanks.
It's just
Paul.
they need their room back at some stage.